Here we go again. Look, I don't want to feel this way about another highly anticipated, hype-fueled film, but I do. Let's get this out of the way right off the bat. Eternals isn't good. The longer I sit with it, the less I like it. Look, if there's one thing I've always encouraged the MCU to do, it's to take risks. We went over this already when we talked about Shang-Chi. 26 films in, the series has found its formula, one that does gangbusters at the box office, and even generally finds a respectable critical reception at worst. But when the films don't seek to push boundaries, plugging and playing new heroes and locations, xeroxing the story structure, look, we've been through this before, you get it at this point, things tend to become stale. But now that Phase 4 is in full swing, the MCU feels like it's having a bit of an identity crisis. It wants to try new things, but it also wants to give audiences the same things they've enjoyed during the Infinity Saga, and as a result, it falters in the latter, but arguably fails outright in the former. It didn't start that way. WandaVision is only really let down in this way by its finale. Black Widow, for feeling a little familiar, entertained as a spy caper and a compelling character piece, and Loki felt like Phase 4's one true case of an artist being able to tell a new story with no holds barred. And then we arrive at Shang-Chi. It was good, but it feels like a movie that wanted to go into a new direction while being cut off at the knees by MCU mandates. And now we have Eternals. Okay, look, Marvel, when I said I wanted you to take risks and be bold and let the artist's vision shine through, that doesn't mean I wanted you to forget how to tell stories in the first place. But how did that even become the case? After all, this is a movie helmed by Chloe Zhao, who is the most recent winner, rightly so, of Best Director and Best Picture. This is a movie boasting a massively talented cast, an epic supernatural threat to Earth, and an ambitious introduction to new MCU heroes and lore. But there's the operative word, ambitious. This movie wants to do a lot. Chloe Zhao is clearly pushing for something bold, but it feels like the MCU is pushing back. In the squished, deformed mess that is made by getting caught in between, you end up with a film that ends up trying to do too much at once, and as a result, dilutes the ambition. Because ambition only gets you so far. The execution has to match up with it, and in Eternals' case, it doesn't, which is really unfortunate. Zhao had a story she wanted to tell. She had a vision and the resources to pull it off. But I think ultimately, it's let down by both the fact that Eternals is too tightly bound to its larger franchise, and how it doesn't seem like, with all the world building and exposition needed for things to make sense, it was the best fit for Zhao's filmmaking and storytelling style. So strap in, folks, and stay for an eternity, for a little bit, to learn why Eternals doesn't live up to its potential. But before we get into that, if you're an immortal superhero, if you're going to be taking an eternal vacation on Earth, you're probably gonna get restless, right? You'll need to occupy your time somehow, so what better way to spend it than to explore your creativity by learning a new skill? Well, thanks to this video's sponsor, Skillshare, virtually anything you've ever wanted to learn can be accomplished right at your fingertips. Skillshare is an online community of learning that inspires its members to broaden their horizons in a creative way that is personal to them through thousands of premium classes that can allow them to discover something new or deepen their love of something they already know about. The possibilities are almost limitless. Do you want to start making videos of your own? Well, it's pretty easy to find classes on setting up a studio, on recording and editing audio, and on video editing. Have you taken those classes and used what you learned to make the greatest video essay of all time, but you can't get past that pesky YouTube algorithm in order for it to reach every last pair of eyes and ears it deserves to? There are Skillshare classes on social media marketing and getting the most out of YouTube waiting for you. For me, Thomas Frank's class on productivity for creatives really helped me focus and enhance my own creative process behind making a lot of Film Speaks videos and just managing my time to the best of my ability. The whole class is great, but Thomas is also a YouTuber, so his lesson on how to set up both my physical and digital workspace, on how to be more organized and best utilize my time, particularly resonated with me, someone who is really bad at time management and productivity and making the most of my time for every single waking hour of the day. I've been on YouTube for 6 years, and oh my god, it sounds really weird to say that, but Thomas was still able to give me new ideas and tools to apply towards this channel. And my experience is a microcosm of why Skillshare is so great. Skillshare is crafted specifically to allow you to focus on and expand your learning. And to that end, there are absolutely no ads, and Skillshare is always launching new premium classes so that you can go on a journey with your creativity and come out on the other end of that journey with an enhanced love and understanding of what your skill might be. To facilitate your discovery, the first 1,000 FilmSpeak subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So what are you waiting for? Join Skillshare today and start exploring your creativity to the fullest. And thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. Now, we're going to toss it over to my buddy Owen from Owen Likes Comics to delve a bit into the comics history of the Eternals and the difficulty that comes with adapting them for the big screen.
When asking the question, who or what are the Eternals, it's hard to separate the superhero team from their iconic creator, Jack Kirby. Truthfully, the Eternals are one of the most significant creations in Kirby's entire career. You see, Kirby had been an industry titan in the world of superheroes since the early 1940s, when he and writer Joe Simon teamed up to create the star-spangled hero, Captain America. From here, Kirby would form a long-standing partnership with Stan Lee, with the pair creating almost all of the modern Marvel universe fans know and love today. However, by the late 1960s, Kirby's relationship with Lee and Marvel began to sour, as the artist felt he was underappreciated and overlooked in his contributions to the company's success, and as a result, he made the decision to jump to the company's greatest rivals, DC Comics, in 1970. At DC, Kirby was given free rein to demonstrate that he was not only the greatest artist working in the industry at the time, but a talented writer too, penning 3 original titles that were to be the ultimate manifestation of his individual creativity and genius. These were Mr. Miracle, Forever People, and The New Gods, all released under the umbrella term of the Fourth World. The New Gods in particular was to be Kirby's magnum opus, an epic Shakespearean space fantasy that combined traditional superhero storytelling with classic mythology. The story of the New Gods would focus on the war between New Genesis and Apocalypse, introducing iconic DC characters like Darkseid, Orion, Steppenwolf, and Highfather in the process. To Kirby, the Fourth World was to be his crowning achievement. However, this sprawling space fantasy series failed to resonate with readers, and reality struck when DC cancelled the New Gods following the release of its 11th issue, with Kirby eventually leaving the company altogether in 1975. Reluctantly returning to Marvel the following year, Kirby was given the opportunity to not only continue writing his own books, but also serve as his own editor, allowing him to try once more at telling the epic intergalactic saga he'd envisaged years earlier. This time though, he would combine his fascination with Shakespearean drama with the growing theory of ancient aliens, particularly drawing inspiration from Eric von Dakenen's 1968 book, Chariot of the Gods. As opposed to simply being godlike beings who lived on another world, this new team would be otherworldly beings from the stars who came to Earth centuries ago, and watched over and helped shape human civilization in the process. Combining these influences, Kirby would introduce Marvel readers to the Celestials, a race of cosmic beings who have existed since the dawn of the universe, and their 2 subspecies, the Eternals and the Deviants. Initially, Kirby intended for this new series to be titled The Celestials. However, Marvel pushed for the book to be named Return of the Gods, likely seeking to capitalise on its similarities to Dakenen's infamous novel, as well as its role as a spiritual sequel to DC's New Gods. Eventually though, legal disputes would cause Marvel to settle on the name The Eternals, and in July of 1976, the first issue of this exciting new series would hit shelves. Kirby's Eternal comic would run for a total of 19 issues, all of which were written and drawn by the man himself. In these books, readers would be introduced to the characters of Ikaris, Ajak, Sersi, Thena, and Makkari, as well as the villainous Deviants and their leader Crow, who would attack New York City and force the Eternals, who had previously existed only in the shadows, to enter the spotlight and defend the world they swore to oversee. Admittedly, while this series did showcase Kirby's unquestionable creativity, the Eternals ultimately failed to resonate with Marvel's readership, and much like the New Gods before it, the series was cancelled before Kirby could conclude his larger-than-life story. After the cancellation of the comic, in January 1978 though, Kirby's Eternals Eternals would continue to inform many different aspects of the Marvel Universe. In particular, the Celestials became a central part of the developing cosmic side to the company's stories, giving way to the creation of now iconic Marvel villains such as Thanos. While the Eternals would be relaunched several times throughout the subsequent decades, with the most notable coming in 2006 with Neil Gaiman and John Romita Jr.'s miniseries, I've always found them to be a somewhat difficult concept to properly execute. Although I think the idea of the Eternals as a species within the Marvel Universe is genuinely fascinating, I don't think it's unfair for me to say that they've never quite grabbed audiences in the way Kirby and those at Marvel at the time had hoped. For me personally, I struggle to empathise and relate to the Eternals in their comic book incarnation. The concept of these highly evolved ancient beings that watched over humanity for centuries may be fascinating, but at times it can make these characters seem somewhat void of emotion and difficult to truly connect in the way I do with so many of Marvel's other characters, or even some of the new Gods characters like Mr. Miracle, for example. I do think they're a worthy and necessary addition to the Marvel Universe, especially if their cinematic endeavours continues to expand its cosmic boundaries. But the question of whether Chloe Zhao can realise the true potential of the Eternals, to me, remains to be seen.
It's interesting in Kirby's original run that the Celestials overshadowed the Eternals in their own series because a similar thing happens in Zhao's Eternals. Simply put, the Eternals themselves are the least interesting part of the movie, and so much of it comes down to the fact that they're not allowed to feel distinct, human, or special. The very nature of the Celestials, Eternals, and really people with superpowers in general should feel wondrous and awe-inspiring, not only to the audience, but to the ordinary people we see on screen that populate the world of the MCU. You only have to look at, I don't know, every other comic book film character to see this done right. However, when the Deviants, basically just these giant monsters, which we'll get into a little bit later on, resurface, terrorizing civilization, and the Eternals fight them, no one blinks an eye. A giant fucking space robot bigger than a planet, aka a Celestial, sticks his head into the Earth's atmosphere, and no one really seems to care. Perhaps Thanos' snap numbed people to the extraordinary, but when these massive, cosmic-level, almost apocalyptic events happen, and people like Kit Harrington's character, whose name I've actually already forgotten, act barely surprised, it erases the magic of these things in the world of the film and subsequently dulls the experience for us in the cinema. It comes across as intergalactic jargon and noise. Nothing feels tangible and real. It all feels so insignificant and cold. The extraordinary has now become the ordinary because of the MCU's overpopulation of characters and regularly occurring world-ending cosmic events. Even these beings, the Eternals, who've been around since the dawn of humanity, don't faze anyone on screen, which again makes my reaction more or less, well, if all of you on screen don't feel the impact of these characters, how the hell am I supposed to? I never feel the excitement or wonder of these centuries-old beings. If we were to compare them to the members of the Justice League in the Snyderverse, which is essentially what they feel like in this film, and the film even pokes fun at Ikaris being a Superman ripoff, we feel the human response to when Superman arrives on Earth and decimates Metropolis. In BVS, Batman is almost a personification of humanity's fear of these emerging gods. People like Aquaman, Cyborg, Wonder Woman, The Flash are all met with wonder and awe from the people around them, but also with fear and controversy. It's not just universally accepted with a nod and a shrug, and these characters are also humanized by the time we spend with them, with the people around them, and by the fact that, while they've lived in the shadow of humanity for so long, they've also lived life as humans, and there's this relatability to them. We feel it at almost every moment. Compare that to the Eternals, who are these hollow robotic beings, partially by design, but still. They're so hard to latch onto because it's just naturally more difficult for humans to relate and see ourselves in these mythic, godlike figures, and the amount of time needed to create that connection just isn't present in this film. Now, I'll be the first to admit, as much as I love Zack Snyder's DC films, I do think that some of the fandom overinflates the influence that those movies have on the MCU or other pop culture media. I think that he did establish some techniques and some visual flourishes that have found its way into the mainstream of depicting superhuman godlike beings such as Superman, but for the most part, I don't think studios and filmmakers are out here just cribbing Zack Snyder. That being said, upon rewatching Eternals, I did notice some things that struck me as very Snyder-esque, and I think it's why the film ultimately doesn't work. This is going to come off a bit harsh, and I in no way mean this as a slap in the face to Chloe Zhao, but I do think that Eternals comes across as a bad Zack Snyder ripoff. While it's undoubtedly a Chloe Zhao film, stylistically, I think some of the storytelling mechanics were used better in a film like Man of Steel. Let me get something out of the way. I hate making comparisons between filmmakers, especially filmmakers that don't necessarily have any correlation to one another. I don't think Chloe Zhao is remotely like Zack Snyder, and I don't think Zack Snyder is remotely like Chloe Zhao. They feel like two filmmakers with two distinct styles that are interested in telling stories in two different ways. It just so happens with a film like Eternals, Chloe Zhao was dipping into the Zack Snyder school of thought in deconstructing heroes. And now, having seen Eternals 2 times, the Zack Snyder influence, whether intentional or not, is even more apparent. And it's not just in a visual sense. Yeah, there are a lot of Zack Snyder-isms, specifically in how the Speedster operates and how Ikaris is very Superman-esque, not just in his stature, but also in his fighting ability. Really, the Eternals in general just feel like a larger Justice League with significantly less depth to their characters. But it got me thinking about this idea that people take for granted Zack Snyder's ability as a storyteller. People look at Zack Snyder and they just think of the visuals. They just think of the surface level version of Snyder. They mock his pretentiousness in the stories and the ideas he's interested in telling and exploring. But the fact of the matter is that is all genuine. That's all Zack Snyder. That's what he's fascinated with. He has such a deep understanding and love of mythology, philosophy, human nature. And so when he takes all of those elements and he combines it into a film like Man of Steel to explore a character like Superman, who has been in the pop culture zeitgeist for decades. He's one of the most iconic characters in pop culture. He basically established comic book heroes as we know them. So when he takes all of these ideas of gods living among men, of Greek myth, and he seeks to deconstruct that in a film like Man of Steel, it works because Superman was a character that was ripe for deconstruction. He's been with us long enough that we understand fully who he is, so now we can go to the opposite end of the spectrum and explore the deepest parts of his humanity and how the world around us would receive a character like that. And that deconstruction and those ideas are further explored in Batman v Superman Ultimate Edition and finally in Zack Snyder's Justice League, where it all comes to a head. With a film like Eternals, Chloe Zhao tries to take the Man of Steel approach to deconstructing these heroes that we know nothing about. And it also doesn't help that Eternals isn't a popular or revered comic run. Like we just mentioned earlier, the most popular characters when the Eternals were initially introduced to us were the Celestials. The Eternals themselves in the comics are very cold and distant. We can't relate to who they are as people, and so a lot of the issues that this film has stems from the fact that the source material just isn't very interesting. And so when you combine that with Chloe Zhao wanting to take this more introspective and highbrow philosophical approach to exploring these characters as people, it doesn't quite connect with an audience. It also doesn't help that she's working with 10 characters, and after reading an interview and understanding that there were originally 12 characters and she thought that just cutting out 2 would help, it makes you wonder why she didn't combine some of these excess characters into one person. 2 or 3 of these people could have been one character, and it's not like the Eternals are this highly popular, highly sensationalized group of comic book characters. You can take risks and you can take creative liberties with them and consolidate in order to give us a more compelling and character-driven film and afford these characters the time and real estate to become fully formed individuals. Zack Snyder is a very competent filmmaker. He understands that his approach to telling stories doesn't necessarily work with every property out there. His approach to the DC universe works because we have been with those characters for decades. We've seen them in various iterations in the pop culture zeitgeist. So to see them deconstructed and explored in a different way in this big, operatic, epic, mythic, philosophical meditation, whatever you want to call it, in that way, it works on screen. Now, of course, that's just my opinion, but I happen to think it works. Eternals simply misses that part. You can't deconstruct a set of characters we've never spent time with. We don't know who they are. We don't understand them as people. It just ends up coming across as cold, and because you're doing this with 10 characters, it feels like they're more archetypes than they are fully formed people. And so you have to wonder, when Chloe Zhao pitched them this idea of adapting the Eternals, whether or not she mentioned Man of Steel or not, I have no idea. You have to wonder if Marvel was a little bit high on their own supply, and they followed the trajectory of one of the lead characters in this film, Ikaris. They got a little cocky. They thought, oh, we made this work with Guardians of the Galaxy, Ant-Man, properties like this that shouldn't theoretically work in a film, but we've managed to find a way to do it. They must have thought, oh, the Eternals, yeah, of course it'll work. We're Marvel, we can do this, and we can approach it in any way we see fit. And so like Ikaris, I think they got a big head, and they flew a bit too close to the sun, and, well, we know what happened to that character, and I think the same can be said for Eternals. I think Chloe Zhao was on the right track with showing how the Eternals have domesticated and learned as much from humanity as humanity learned from them, but it's not given enough time to marinate. It's a film hindered by the very nature of Kirby's original work, and seems like it so desperately wants to establish fully formed characters, but there are too many of them, and they all feel kinda samey? Take Sersi. She loves humanity and is the one with this deep connection to Earth and the people, but that's it. That's all there is to her character, and she's supposed to be the main protagonist. Ikaris, aside from basically being the Homelander Superman archetype, is this company man, the true believer dedicated to carrying out his mission at all costs, and it's fine. I enjoyed the ideological conflict he has with Sersi, who seeks to go against the wishes of her master because it's the morally right thing to do, and also because she loves humanity. And we see this philosophical debate of what's right and what's wrong in flashbacks during pivotal moments in humanity, but it never feels like it scratches much beyond the surface, and especially for Sersi, I never get a sense of her true love of humanity. We don't ever get a real conversation about their differences of opinions. It's certainly told to us, but I never feel it. There's an interesting idea for a movie in there with the notion that Ikaris and Sersi were together in the past. They were two people very much in love and separated because of ideological differences. Unlike Homelander and Superman, especially Supes, who, is actually a good and moral person, Ikaris is just a one-note archetype. This is made a lot worse by his actions in the climax of the film, where he turns from not wanting to interfere with the emergence to abandoning his ideology after a flashback with Sersi, which is supposed to signal that, oh, Sersi's the one that makes me feel human. Even though I've never felt that for the entire 2 hours and 30 minutes of the film, but okay, sure, just give up your entire ethos, the very thing that makes you you, in about 5 seconds. Also, I'm sorry, but calling your character Ikaris and then launching him into the sun after his turn is laughably on the nose. If it weren't for the other issues in this film, maybe you could get away with it. But when you have a character who is as flat and underdeveloped as this, and your solution is to fall back on his Greek mythological namesake at the last minute, it's like you tried to put out a fire with kerosene. Or, sorry, it's like you tried to fix your wax wings by throwing them at the sun. Since we're just being as surface level on the nose as can be. On the other end of the spectrum, Richard Madden and Gemma Chan really missed the mark in their performances. These are two great actors who have delivered great work in previous projects, but feel very underutilized, one-note, and unremarkable. It just adds to how empty their characters feel. The empty shells of characterization sort of trickle down through the rest of the ensemble, too. The only truly interesting one is Angelina Jolie's Thena, who has this dealing with trauma sort of arc that's incredibly compelling, I might add, but it's entirely too secondary and rushed in the third act. So even when Eternals has a character with meat to them, that character isn't given enough time. Truthfully, her arc was the only one that had any real humanity or emotional resonance to it, and that's with it being shafted, and honestly is probably a credit to Jolie's performance more so than it is the writing of the character itself. Jolie understood how to give this shell of a character humanity, how to fill them with empathy and tap into a really interesting dynamic, such as the fact that she's basically suffering from the Eternals version of Alzheimer's. And the relationship she has with Gilgamesh, while undercooked, is still more compelling than most of the other character work and relationships we get throughout the course of this film. It also doesn't help that where her arc eventually goes is so detached from everything else that's going on that when we cut to it during the climax, it halts all momentum the film has going for it, which, granted, isn't a whole lot. As for Sprite, their desire to experience all the fruits of maturity and what it's like to have the mind of an adult while being forced to exist in a child's body is told to us, but it's never really shown. They get emotional about it, and there are vague hints of how impactful a character like Sprite should be, but there's never a moment where I feel moved by this. It should be a really emotional moment. A person being in love, being alive for centuries, and yet being imprisoned in the body of a child. It's like Peter Pan, as the film so explicitly spoon-feeds us, then never explores that allegory further. Phastos, meanwhile, is a pacifist. This becomes clearer after the advancements he introduced to humanity brought about the atomic bomb, and it makes sense why he would want to domesticate and carry on as a human. Actually, speaking of domestication, they don't really get into his life as a father, as a husband, and how that's shaped him. While it's nice to see this kind of representation on screen, his queerness feels more performative than characteristic. It's great that we finally have an openly gay couple kiss on screen in the MCU for the first time, and the importance of that kind of representation should not, and I repeat this, should not be overlooked. But I wanted more from that relationship, other than he has a family. I mean, okay, yeah, he wants to save humanity because he has a family, but that's exactly the problem. His queerness and his family are just a springboard for him to get involved with the action of the film. Is that enough? Well, for some of you, it might be, and that's great. But not for me, when there's so much rich texture to mine for a character like this. And not when such a big deal has been made about this film being a benchmark for representation. Don't get me wrong, this is certainly better than gay Joe Russo from Avengers Endgame, but I wanted more from his character as a whole. It's really unfortunate how repetitive of a criticism this can be for the main characters of Eternals. You can boil a lot of this down to, this character has an interesting idea behind them, but nothing gets done with them because they only get to have a morsel of screen time to themselves. Druig, played by Barry Keoghan, might actually be the worst example of this problem because he's the closest to having a fully formed arc. And not only that, he has the most interesting ideas associated with his character. He has the ability to control the minds and will of humanity, and wants to in order to prevent humanity from committing the countless number of atrocities that we have as a species over the course of our existence. But the fact of the matter is, he's barred from doing so by Ajak. You honestly could have made an entire film about this moral dilemma as it pertains to Druig and the rest of the Eternals, about him creating his own utopia in the Amazon, and about his journey to learn how, despite all the awful stuff humanity is capable of, humanity's flaws are what make them special and are what make them, well, human. His epiphany that stripping them of free will is not the answer should have been incredibly satisfying, and it would have been if it felt like the earned ending of a properly fleshed out arc. Again, so many of the interesting ideas and philosophies and moral dilemmas Eternals poses are quickly resolved in a matter of minutes, especially as it pertains to Druig. I never got the sense that he learned to accept humanity, that he learned to let go of his control and let humans be humans. But the character who gets absolutely nothing and is the worst off out of the bunch is Makkari, played by the incredible Lauren Ridloff. She is horribly shafted from a character standpoint. She's hardly in the film and basically shows up at the end as the speedster on the roster and someone who's had a thing with Druig and who has been just chilling underground for centuries with a cache of ancient relics and oh, that's it! It's especially frustrating when, again, in flashbacks, there are hints at a potentially rich character arc. That being said, it was incredible to see a deaf actress play a main hero in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I just wish they would have given her more material to have a compelling arc. Honestly, these characters have a hint of something interesting in all of them, but in every instance, it's not explored properly. Hell, the movie doesn't even have the real estate necessary to do so because it spreads itself completely thin between too many characters. Maybe this adds to the unremarkable nature of the world of the film because you have this massive group of people who are all ageless superheroes. They're not clearly defined people. Even some of their powers aren't clearly defined. It's just an a la carte of choose your own powers. And yeah, sure, you can turn your finger guns into lethal weapons and shoot lasers out of them. Sure, Ikaris, you can have heat visions. Thena, go ahead, craft a spear out of thin air and throw it at someone. They could easily be condensed into one or two characters, which would both allow them extra focus, but also add to the wonder of the thing. I mean, if you were to learn that there was one person with these abilities in the world, even in a world where Iron Man and the Hulk and Thanos already exist, you'd probably still find wonder in that. But when you find out that there are a dozen and they all show up at once, it doesn't feel grand or intimidating. It feels commonplace. Superheroes wouldn't be as cool if everyone was a damn superhero. Once again, if the impact is diluted in the world of the film, how is it supposed to land for us in the audience? This seems like a problem with two obvious solutions. The first is a bit complicated. Remember how each of the Avengers either got a solo film or at least had some kind of substantial involvement in an MCU film before we got The Avengers? Well, Hawkeye kind of got shafted in that regard, but I mean, 5 out of the 6 ain't bad. You could have done an entire series of films about Ikaris and Sersi, about Druig, about Sprite, and about Phastos. At the very least, those first 2 films were kind of necessary. They need the real estate for either of those 2 arcs to land. And it's not like the MCU doesn't have a vacuum of character pieces to fill. Half of the Avengers are dead. Giving us lead-up films to the Eternals, who are arguably the biggest ensemble group of heroes in the MCU now, would have filled that hole perfectly. But let's be real, you don't have to do solo films before a team-up movie. I think Guardians of the Galaxy and Zack Snyder's Justice League prove that. And building towards that team-up movie can be a bit complicated, especially if the solo films you're putting out don't have the returns you had hoped for. So there's another option. Don't make the Eternals movie. Not having the Eternals in the MCU would arguably be better than having sketches of them crammed into a single film. You know what, now that I think about it, maybe they should have just done this as a Disney Plus series. That would have worked a lot better. But that brings us to Chloe Zhao. I can see why Zhao, a phenomenal humanist storyteller, was selected to helm the project after her incredible pitch. She's precisely the kind of person that can make these innately cold and hollow characters feel human. She's exactly the director this movie needed in order to spend the proper amount of time needed to connect the heroes to the audience. If you've seen either The Rider or Nomadland, you'll know that Zhao's films take the time to marinate in that space. She points a camera at her subject and orbits them, documenting them as people, grounding them in our world, ultimately humanizing them with the slow burn of her magic. Unfortunately, Eternals, with all of its characters and plot that needs to be squeezed in, the screenplay doesn't give her the same kind of space to linger with these characters and allow us to feel their humanity like she does in her earlier films. It comes in brief spurts, but it's hardly enough. I'm seeing the pieces, I know what the movie wants to say and how it wants me to feel, but the larger puzzle is never properly assembled. Even the more lively Eternals, played by Kumail Nanjiani and Brian Tyree Henry, feel like they're filling out slots on a super team roster. Especially Kumail's character, who's adapted to humanity quite nicely, being a Bollywood filmmaker and movie star. While the Eternals are supposed to be their own people and find individuality that makes them uniquely them, they all come across as one personality trait of a shared person, with nothing tangible below the surface. The characters, metaphorically, have the same voice, and as a result, are not only interchangeable, half of them really don't need to be there. With everything going on in the film, compared to the intimacy a storyteller like Zhao is accustomed to, Eternals simply does not afford Chloe Zhao the time and real estate to be cerebral, to again point a camera in the direction of real people and just document them as people. The movie wants to do this. In some instances, it succeeds, but more often than not, it fails, and it's just a frustrating viewing experience. The plot kind of hampers this further. There's a giant celestial on the verge of being birthed out of the earth, primed to destroy the entire planet in the process. There's this ticking clock, which doesn't necessarily mesh with Zhao's methodical, pensive character work. And when you combine that with the convoluted nature of the Eternals mythos, you get a film at odds with itself, resulting in a zero-sum story. Yes, there are some narrative consequences that will affect the world going forward. Yes, there are some implications for the MCU, but I could have just read the cliff notes. Hell, I could have had those consequences happen in a post-credits scene for another movie, and I would have been left with the same feeling I felt walking out of the theater. So to bring it back to the lack of wonder felt in this film, if the people on Earth in the MCU feel so unfazed by the presence of Celestials and the Eternals, and the film doesn't fill out those characters enough for us to latch on to, the movie becomes this series of pretty-looking golden hour shots stitched together, and little more. I can see what Chloe was going for, and with less characters and moving pieces, she's probably the best person they could have brought on to humanize cold and distant godlike beings. But the overstuffed screenplay and even more overstuffed cast prevent her from doing that. Perhaps if it had been centered around just one character, the magic of Chloe Zhao would have worked in spades. In fact, even after watching this, I am now a massive advocate for a Chloe Zhao Superman film. I don't think the issue is that superheroes aren't Zhao's bag. The issue is that an ensemble bursting at the seams is not conducive to nuanced storytelling and character studies, unless you want to make a 6-hour movie. Similar to Zack Snyder, if she were working with Clark Kent, I think she has the ability to tap into his humanity and, by extension, humanize the last son of Krypton. I can appreciate the ambition and want Marvel to take more swings like this because I can feel the artist's voice so prominently behind this. I just don't think the storytelling is very good. I certainly feel Chloe Zhao in every frame of this film, even at times where everything else in the movie seems to be falling apart. She was an ambitious hire on the part of Marvel. The ambition of shoving the Eternals into the MCU and going full tilt into their story is admirable, and Zhao's ambition as a filmmaker is always there in every project she's involved in. I think Eternals really just shows that ambition is only one ingredient needed to make a great epic, and that the execution needs to both live up to and temper the ambition in order to really deliver the final product everyone intended. As is the first thing stated at the beginning of this video, ambition alone does not make a great film. And what does Eternals have going for it other than ambition? Alright, you still with me? You hate me yet? Well, in case you couldn't tell, Eternals is a movie that the longer I sit with it, the more I dislike it. I'm not usually one to go out of my way and pick at logic gaps in a film, but when the gaps severely impede the emotionality of the story being told, the larger ramifications of the MCU, and most importantly, my overall f***ing enjoyment, they must be addressed. Ikaris turning on a dime at the end is probably the biggest offender, as the heel face turn all but slaps you in the face when it happens. But it's also completely jarring how Kingo, who has this interesting development of not wanting to get involved at all in the fate of humanity or the birth of this Eternal, and just up and leaves, never has that decision addressed in the rest of the movie. You might not be consciously thinking about it the first time you watch Eternals, but it's made pretty clear that all of them need to unite to stop the emergence. So how do they manage to do it without Kingo? Well, they do, somehow, magically, with no explanation. And then when Kingo reappears at the end of the film and the day is saved and everyone's all happy, no one seems to care that he just left them high and dry. There's no resolution to that decision that was made towards the end of the film. And that's just a taste of the randomness of the logic in this film, something I can usually forgive if the story functions enough, functions emotionally, but here, it's a detriment to the whole damn experience. Story issues aside, Eternals is also a disappointing MCU film from a visual standpoint. It's worse in that respect when you look at the visuals of Chloe Zhao's other films, especially the frame-by-frame artistry of Nomadland. And sure, the cinematography is once again gorgeous, any shot that's just a couple of people in a golden hour vista looks incredible, but the Deviants look awful considering the advancements that have been happening in CGI during the course of the MCU. I mean, look at how seamlessly Thanos is integrated into the Avengers films. You almost forget that he's CGI. The shoddy effects work for the Deviants, on the other hand, is a damn shame, and it's not even a creative look for these monsters. The Deviants also get shafted from a story perspective. They're arguably the most sympathetic outcasts in the film given how mistreated they were by the Celestials, and yet that sympathy is shoehorned in as they're essentially cannon fodder for the Eternals to show off their Rolodex of powers. Similar to the Eternals themselves, but far worse, they're never clearly defined. Their tragic story lacks any ounce of emotionality and ultimately convolutes the whole thing. Even our heroes are just walking shells, devoid of personality. And honestly, for all of Chloe Zhao's attempts to break the MCU formula, a lot of that formula is still here. I just don't care about anything that's going on here. I want to reiterate one thing. I don't dislike Eternals because it's different. I want ambition in the MCU. I plead for it. I crave it. I want the formula to be broken. I want top-tier artists to be able to swing for the fences every time with these films. But if you're going to do that, then let the artist's vision guide it. Don't bring someone like Chloe Zhao on board only to neuter her efforts at creating fully realized characters. I would rather have a film completely satisfy an artist's vision but miss the mark than one that is torn between the artist and the larger franchise and that feels at odds with itself as a result. And that's where it gets frustrating. For all the notions that Eternals is a new frontier, for all of the risks that it does take, it's foundationally broken and still, albeit far less than previous entries, rests on the laurels of the MCU at large, even if it does a solid job of fooling you. World-ending event? Check. Shoehorned humor? Check. Don't hype this up as just being different. Don't make this big thing about a sex scene only for it to be one of the most dispassionate, soulless, and emotionless ones I've ever seen. I mean, it's a thing that just happens, which is also how I would describe most of the events in Eternals. These big character moments, revelations, twists, resolutions to arcs, they just happen. And yeah, I am disappointed. I can see the greatness there, or at least the crumbs of it. And however you feel about the representation in Eternals, let me make one more thing clear. Representation matters. I'm glad to see the deaf community, LGBTQ+, Asian, Indian, Middle Eastern, Black communities given prominent roles in a major tentpole film like this. We can still applaud how expansive Eternals is in that regard, while also recognizing, on the whole, it's not a very good movie, at least in my opinion. Both things can be true at once. They aren't mutually exclusive, and as a film critic, commentator, video essayist, whatever you want to call me, it's important to acknowledge both things in the hope that future films, hopefully big tentpole ones, with this kind of representation, can do better. Just as ambition alone doesn't equal a good movie, representation alone, no matter how commendable it may be, does not equal a good movie. I feel for Chloe Zhao. I feel like the intentions behind this film were to make a grand, epic entrance for a new group of superheroes, but it just feels hollow. And yeah, I know Guardians of the Galaxy did something similar to this, but honestly, the ensemble is only 5 characters deep, and it, most importantly, played to James Gunn's strengths as a filmmaker, and being such a master of relationships, managed to use each member of the team to develop the others in a symbiotic way. It all felt human and natural, these broken individuals finding each other and assembling into one family. With Eternals, I can't confidently say Chloe Zhao was able to fully play to her strengths as a filmmaker, and therein lies the problem. Maybe it's just the nature of working within the confines of the studio system, maybe it's working within the confines of an interconnected universe, or maybe with all the moving pieces, she just bit off a bit more than she could chew. I honestly don't know. I wonder if perhaps their ambition is starting to eclipse their grasp, and especially with all the multiverse shenanigans on the horizon, I can't help but feel more nervous about the future of the MCU. After Endgame, they should have looked inward, gone back to basics, and focused on telling isolated, compelling character stories. The ones that made us fall in love with Iron Man or Captain America. The answer was not to go bigger, especially when introducing characters we've never seen on the screen before. Phase 4 doesn't seem to understand that you can't rely on Spider-Man to do all of the heavy lifting while you treat the new characters like an afterthought. And not only does Eternals treat its titular heroes like afterthoughts, an afterthought is what this film ultimately feels like as well.